want to walk you through what my personal experiences have taught me about success. So this talk is not so much about outcomes of my research. It's a special talk for me. I made this talk especially for this seminar. And I want to reflect some of the things that I've learned through the years of working in case studies. So it's a bit different than the usual seminars that probably you would hear. So I am going to talk about case studies in the Gulf of California. And the reason why I decided to talk about that is because I'm actually from there. And these case studies are case studies that I sort of grew up with. I grew up listening about them. And then as I become more involved in research, they've become an integral part also of my research. So I sort of, these are case studies that have taught me a bunch. The Gulf of California and the place that I grew up with is La Paz. It's in the south tip of Baja. It's highly dependent on fisheries, and small-scale fisheries play a very important role in the livelihoods of people there. So that's why also my focus on my research and the case studies that I'm going to present are about small-scale fisheries. So first, I want to say that because I had put this talk for this seminar in particular, I didn't feel comfortable just sharing my reflections. I also talked to a bunch of people that have worked in these case studies, not a bunch, but like very influential people that have worked in these case studies throughout their entire lives. So I just wanted to hear from them a little bit more, resolve some questions before I presented them here. And so I wanted to just acknowledge that a lot of the work that I'm presenting has actually been performed by the people that are here in this slide. And one of them is actually my brother. So that's why I'm also very close to some of these case studies. Okay, so also today, I felt like it was important for me to give a definition of small-scale fisheries, because for those that in this audience are probably very familiar with the fact that it's really hard to define small-scale fisheries, and every place defines them in a different way. So for me, it was important to start with what I am referring to as small-scale fisheries for this particular talk. So I'm talking about fisheries that are performed by households, not by companies, and that are performed usually in very small vessels. The fisheries that I'm going to talk about today are fisheries where fishers do day trips, maybe don't stay in the ocean for many days, so they can use small vessels for their activities. And one important thing about the fisheries that I'm going to talk about today is that they play a very important role in food security for the communities of the Gulf of California. So because fisheries play a very important role in livelihoods and the livelihoods of communities, we have to think about success in these fisheries in a different way. And I'm sure some of you have heard some of these points in the previous talks in the seminar. But I wanted to steal one particular talk from one particular talk, which was Chris's in the first day. And he did this exercise where everybody wrote what they thought success was. And this is what came up. And so sustainability came to be a big part of what most people in the audience consider success. And then we see fish, profitable, productive, money, but we also see there some aspects of equity, happiness, well-being. So I want us right now to think a little bit more about, this is our perspective from Seattle. But if we were that fisher that I had the picture of before, what would be important for that person there? So sustainability, definitely, money too, but also perhaps food, culture, family, health, and among other things. So we need to start amplifying our ideas of success when we talk about small-scale fisheries. And also, I want to highlight that when we think about sustainability, we usually think about a set of rules that are going to be followed. But when we think about sustainability, we also need to think about how the governance systems that are going to lead us to sustainability are maintained through time. And when we talk about small-scale fisheries, that is particularly important, because they are susceptible to many external factors that might disrupt whatever decisions and dynamics might be happening at the local level. So there's been a lot of work previously on what leads to sustainability at a local level in communities, in artisanal fishing communities. And part of my work has been very focused on this. So what leads to the good management of common pool resources of fisheries. So some of these words might be, some of your work might be related to some of these works. So what creates clear access rights, a lot of my previous work as well as related to that. How can you create clear good rules? What is the room of rules in governance? Collective action, leadership, all of these have been concepts that have been studied in terms of how to maintain strong governance systems and sustainability and achieve sustainability. So that has been a very important body of work, and that has provided a lot of insights. But today I want to invite us to think a little bit more about what are the outside conditions that led communities to be in a condition or the other to begin with. So I know that this was part of the conversation also in some of the previous talks, and I'm happy to hear that this is sort of like a continuous conversation. But I want to talk about these patterns, and how I'm going to do it is through these case studies. And because I needed to rely on a body of literature, the literature of environmental justice has really helped me get a guideline on how to analyze these sort of extrinsic forces that affect where fishing communities are and how different management decisions are going to take effect. So the two case studies I'm going to talk about might be familiar for some of the people here. Both of them are of the creation of no-take zones, one in the upper Gulf of California. The other one is in the western Gulf of the Gulf of California. One was done through a buyout program, that is what I'm going to explore today. And the other one is a story of the creation of a network of temporary closures. One thing I want us to consider when I'm analyzing these two case studies is that I'm not expecting us to perfectly compare them. Both of these case studies evolve in very different conditions and were subject to very different stressors. But I think from both of them, there are lessons that we can learn when we compare them a little bit. Now, I don't know if I'm making myself clear. I want us to see them as stories more than perfectly comparative case studies. So first, the buyout program in the Gulf of California. So for this one, I want to take us back to the early 2000s, and I wonder if everybody here was born when this started. I was born, but I was definitely not at the point where I was influencing anything or studying any of this. So back in the early 2000s, the upper Gulf of California already was an area where fisheries were very important. Fisheries are the main driver of demographic growth and the main economic activity of this area. And the fishers and authorities and researchers were already facing some challenges. So there was a big demographic growth fueled by immigration. So fishing pressure was increasing. There was an expansion of the industrial fishing fleet that seemed to be threatening the local ecosystems. The authorities were observing continual decline in catches, and there was a recognition that there was an absence for any other productive activities in the region. And also in the early 2000s, I cut this graph to kind of position it there. There was another big problem in this area, and that was the declining on the population of an endangered mammal called the vaquita. I have a photo there of one of them. It's this tiny mammal, the population had been declining for many years. It's endemic to the upper Gulf of California, but right in the 2000s is when they started seeing that those numbers were declining very quickly. And that reduction in the population size of vaquita was attributed mostly to small-scale fisheries both shrimp and gill nets used for the harvest of other finfish. So that's where we were. And also, just to put us in the mindset of the Mexican government and everybody working there at that point, this was also the time where the Baiji dolphin, I might pronounce it right, Baiji dolphin was like really showing signs of extinction. I think the last one was seen in 2004, and then there was another site in 2007. So there was an increasing pressure from the Mexican government and from the international community to avoid that from happening again with vaquita. There was a very, very strong sense of urgency in the Gulf of California to take action during those years. The end goal was something like what we have right now. So the end goal of the programs that started being put in place in the 2000s was to create a no-take zone that would protect vaquita in its core area of distribution, and then eventually exclude all gill nets for what it was known to be all of its area of distribution, which is the area with the yellow lines there. And also, yeah, that was the end goal. But the authorities knew that that was really hard to achieve without some financial support, because most fisheries there, most of the communities dependent on this fisheries greatly. So the action to take was to provide financial support at the same time that these regulations were put in place. So there were two efforts two main efforts for a buyout. The first one is called Propoles. Both of them were voluntary, and the main objective was to buy out the permits in exchange for fishers to stop fishing in the core area of the vaquita distribution. There was also one program that also compensated fishers for just not fishing inside of the core area of the vaquita distribution. So that little polygon I showed before. And also a switch out program where fishers could exchange their gear for gear that was more vaquita friendly. So that was the three main strategies that the government used to incentivize fishers to stop fishing where vaquita was distributed. In social terms, it had varied success. I mean, there were a lot of fishers that took part of it, and some of the businesses that were started with these funds did prevail. It was mostly businesses that were related to something that was not fishing or tourism. It was hairstyling or something else, and mostly businesses that were led by women and led in communities that were not as dependent on fisheries as other communities. But eventually the program started to die, and by when it was ending, like in 2015, almost nobody was signing up. It had to do a lot also with that the payments started getting lower. The Mexican government stopped being as interested because they just weren't seeing the results they were expecting, and I'm going to show that soon. And I mean, it was known, and I think this didn't come entirely as a surprise, that not everybody was going to voluntarily give up their nets. It's known that for fishers, it's really hard to change to alternative strategies. And even in early documents from this initiative, I found sentences like this one, like, it must be understood that the individuals currently sustaining themselves through fishing activities will be compelled to change their entire way of life, a way of life that has at times been inherited through several generations. So there was an acknowledgement that it was going to be hard, but you know, I don't know that at what level that was acknowledged. It was a tough thing to foresee what were going to be the consequences of this big effort. So in outcomes in terms of baggage, no, the vaquita continued being caught in the nets of fishers. The vaquita scientists just saw the population decline, and at this point, there's an estimation of less than 20 left, maybe less. And so I wouldn't say that this program, the failing of this program is the one thing that made it fail, but it definitely didn't help. And the reason why it didn't help is that what that researchers have looked into is the first one is capital stuffing, which is that fishers took the money from the buyouts and reinvested it in growing their effort. So, for example, they would give up their boat, but they started using longer nets with the boats that were left. So there was a bioeconomic model done by one of the researchers in Mexico, and he noticed that they pretty much went back to the same level of effort from before the buyout by extending the size of their nets. So that's one thing that has been looked into, and there's clear evidence that they grew the size of their nets. But another thing that is a lot more hidden is on how power structures within the communities actually affected this program. So I'm showing this an awful table, but it's a table from one of the documents that were created back in 2016. And I just want to use it to give you an idea of how power and the control over the fleet was concentrated on a few individuals. So here I'm showing these are the number of permit holders, and these are the number of boats that those permit holders were landing fish for. So the number, what I'm trying to show there is that the fleet actually was way bigger than what you could consider just by thinking of the permits. And the Mexican government could only consider the permit holders when making decisions because they were the only legally recognized fishers in the country. So there were a bunch of fishers that were in the shadows when all of these decisions were taken. And they were marginalized and not considered during the process, right? So this is a common situation. This is how normally, like a lot of Mexican fisheries are currently being managed. There's one permit holder that helps or lands the catch of many non-permitted holders legally. So I want you to imagine what happened when those permit holders gave away their permits. All of those crew members were left without jobs and also left without the funds that would allow them to perform a new alternative, a new productive activity. So here's where I started thinking a lot about environmental justice and how it can help us explain these problems in fisheries. So in this case, there was the distribution of money happened to the permit holders who had a lot of power within these communities. And there was a lack of recognition and a lack of power for those fishers that were actually depending on the activity directly. So, and the program did not consider any mechanisms to disperse the buyout to the crew members. So at that point, the crew members, there was a study by the Center for Biological Diversity, and they said that 13 individuals concentrated 20% of the benefits of the buyout. It exacerbated economic differences within the communities. And the non-permitted fishers then were left with only a few options. One was to move away from the community, but one problem that has been observed by the people I talked to is that they didn't own their land. So if they were to move out, then they would lose their houses. So there was no option for them to migrate. And the other option is to continue fishing illegally or get involved in other illegal activities within the Upper Gulf of California. So this part of the problem and this part of the project has not been analyzed as much as other parts of it, but I think they could have had a huge influence on the state of the Gulf of California currently, which is there's a lot of problems with illegal fishing in the area, and the vaquita population is going down, like pretty much going extinct soon. So these are the type of things that I think we need to start analyzing more. So when I look at it through the lens of environmental justice, it really helped me understood what was happening. And environmental justice scholars have emphasized many times that distribution is not only what makes environmental justice happen. That recognition is a huge part of it. And here, the funds of the buyout process lacked appropriate recognition of who were the players that were going to be affected by these decisions. And it obscured the heterogeneity within the population, the different needs that the different groups of fishers needed, both economically and culturally. So that was my first case study. And now I want us to completely switch gears to a different case study, but I think both of them can teach us really important lessons. So the second one is from this area called El Corredor San Cosme Punta Coyote. This is El Corredor, and I'm going to take you again back to the 2000s. It's in the western coast of the Baja California Peninsula, and it's a set of 13 communities in that area. El Corredor, back in the 2000s, it was completely not in the maps, not of the authorities or the academics. There was not really a lot of work done there. But it was known to be a very important source of seafood for the capital of La Paz, of the state La Paz. And although there's like very important differences, cultural differences, and organizational differences among those communities, all of them share the complete reliance on fisheries for their livelihoods and food. I mean, they're entirely reliant on fishing. These communities back in the day and still today have faced many challenges. They are really hard to access. 6 of them can be accessed through dirt roads, and the remaining 9 are only accessible through boats. They don't have electricity. There's no garbage collection, drainage, or potable water. For example, one of the communities has to travel to another community every week to bring water in big tanks for their households. The Punta Alta community, who are also really, really good fishers, lots of tradition. And there's no health facilities in the area. All of these fishers in this area also, I should say, the people I talked to said that about 80% of fishers do only hook and line fishing. A lot, it has to do with the targeted species. So they target red snapper. To sell it, it depends a lot on the quality of the fish. So nets are used, but it's mostly hook and line. So one of the persons that I talked to told me that their first visits was motivated just by knowing what was going in this region, where they knew a lot of the fish was landed, but they didn't know anything about the place. So they started their work pretty much as an anthropological study, just to see who was there, who were they, what were their needs. And they sent 2 technicians to live in 2 of the towns for 2 years to talk to the fishers. And they found that most of the fishers operated without permits, even though they had been fishing for generations. And that all of them have shared this idea that they needed to fish better. And so I even have this sentence from one of the people I talked to, Amy Hudson, and she was like, we asked, what do you want to do? And many of them answered, we want to take care of our areas, but we don't want a park. They had an example on the north of Loreto, which is a national park, and in the south of Espiritu Santo, and they say they didn't want that. Many of them wanted surveillance, and they had an ethic that defined fishing well. We don't want management. We want everyone to fish well. So we asked, what does that mean for you? So that's that. So at that point, all these fishers perceived that there was a lot of declining on the resources. They also recognized that there were some harmful fishing gear being used, and there were no regulations, that there was no enforcement in the area. They were sort of like in the dark of the authorities. So they proposed a set of solutions throughout those years, like prohibiting shrimp trawling or getting licenses, and it started exploring new ideas like developing exclusive fishing zones for the communities and also temporary no-take zones to recover some of the important fishing grounds of theirs. So an opportunity came that the National Fisheries Law of 2007 of Mexico created this management tool that wasn't defined. So the definition was of the fish refuges was the limited areas in federal waters primarily aimed at conserving and contributing to the development of fishery resources for reproduction, growth, recruitment, while preserving and protecting the surrounding environment, which means nothing. Like it was like they can be no takes, they can be takes, they can be just management. Like there was no real meaning. And really Conapesca, which is the agency, fisheries agency, didn't know what to do with it. So the NGO and the fishers saw this as an opportunity for the definition of fish well. So they started working on the Conapesca leaders, even in a meeting where like, you tell us what you guys want to do with this. So they started doing a bunch of workshops with the community members, researchers, and the NGO to define what this was going to be. In 2010, there was a series of workshops to decide what these areas were going to be. And the NGO technicians that year spent like 280 days on the field. So it was like a very intense work of workshops and talking. And one of the technicians said to me, that's the only way to create a process is to be present, constantly present in a place. And then Conapesca had its first meetings with the fishers ever after they finally got their permits and they started doing this process. So they became evident, they became visible to the authorities for the first time. And they started thinking about these fish refuges as a way to recover grouper, red snapper. Eventually, a map was proposed of these refuges that was signed by 75% of the fishers, but I wanted to give an idea of how hard that process was. This is the fishing zones of the different communities. So each color represents one of the communities. And some of the areas, there was a ton of overlap on their fishing zones. And every single community decided to create an area depending on what they needed. So for example, the community of El Pardito, which is right here, created an area because they wanted to exclude people from a mangrove that they knew had was a very important recruitment area for the snappers that they harvested. And they were also familiar with the fact that there's a set of rocks right here that that those red snappers gonna aggregate at. So they had hopes that if they closed that area, they would get more red snapper in that rocky reef outside. So there were a bunch of reasons why they did it, but it was a very interesting process where they were able to put all these people together to decide on this. So this was the final map created in 2012. The first map created in 2012. A lot of pushback from a lot of people. A lot of pushback mostly from the academic community, because the academic community said, this is a process that was based on anthropology and sociology, not on ecology. And so these areas are not big enough and they're not gonna give any results and they're just gonna, they're gonna fail. Yeah. But one thing that I think is really interesting about what they decided to do is that the areas, they voted that they were going to renew the areas every 5 years. So what this has allowed is this learning process where they started from this like maybe imperfect model of what they wanted their system to look like. And they started modifying it every 5 years. So now some of the areas that didn't yield any results are closed. They are not closed, were not renewed. They're not there anymore. And the ones that were working to recover some of the reefs were grown. So the San Marcial over there, La Brecha, are way bigger than they used to be, and also some areas right here. And I'm sorry for the quality of this map, it's just not helpful. But you can see that there's an area there that is way bigger than it was in the first year. So outcomes in terms of biology, I mean, there are outcomes in terms of biology. There's the two species have shown a higher biomass, and this is one of the things that the NGO created to kind of share the results. But I think that it's hard to tell also how much that has been also the result of increased enforcement from the authorities since these areas were created. So because they were put in the map, now there's a lot more enforcement in the area. So there's I think the joint effect of many things together. In 2009, one of the communities got the FIP certification, which is also an outcome that they're very proud of. And all fishing and underwater monitoring is performed by members of the communities and partners of the NGOs. One thing that this has done is that fishers hold all of the information on these no-take zones. I mean, they have all of the information of how much they catch, how much is there. They participate in the underwater monitoring. They still use hook and line mostly, more attention, yeah. And there's still a lot of challenges with fishing, a lot of fishing from outside areas in the region with large gill nets and large long lines. Yeah, and there's some areas that haven't yielded as much in terms of the recovery of the species. So here, what I want us to focus on is the results in terms of the biology have been positive, and that's something that they've shown through their monitoring efforts and their fishing efforts. But also this case study has created many other things. First, what this NGO did is that they took the actors that were completely marginalized. So imagine these communities had never talked to fisheries authorities, were selling all of their products through intermediaries, and they were very susceptible to any abuse at that point. So through this process, they were brought up to the attention of authorities, and they started to win a place to have a place in the table of this and discussions. And the other thing that I think is very valuable about this process is that now the fishers in these communities do have a lot of information. They manage all of the information. And one of the things that I also have learned through EJ literature is that information really is important when it comes to avoiding injustices. And here, fishers cannot be manipulated through information, withholding information from anybody, right? Like either from NGOs or the government. So I think both of them, both of these things of both bringing these actors to the table by giving them permits and making them official fishers in the front of the authorities of Mexico, and also providing them with information has entirely changed their landscape for the future. So I feel like even though this area has not been under the same stressors as the Upper Gulf of California, these conditions can prevent future situations like the ones we are seeing over there. So that was what I wanted to share with you in terms of these two case studies. And we have a lot of time for questions and discussion. So hopefully that's what is going to happen. Yes.
Do small-scale fisheries tend to have less of an environmental impact, or do they tend to have like hold sustainability more high priority? or an even larger threshold?
No, yeah, I wouldn't like to put that label. I think, you know, we can find all kinds of visions, all kinds of views about the environment, different perspectives about their activities. And so I think it would be really hard for me to say, you know, what their vision, for me to say what the view of their activities is, if they're harmful or not harmful. I would say in the Upper Gulf of California, for example, there are a lot of activities that are considered illegal that small scale fisheries are involved in. Yes, but I think that's that's me already putting a value on what they might not consider as something that is harmful or damaging, right? So if you ask me about their perspective, I think that's really hard to answer. Yep. Yep.
The question about equity in buyouts and then programs that are designed to reduce capital in fisheries is like a really universal one. It's relevant to that in the US too. I'm wondering if you can see any sort of broader lessons from the Cuba example about how to avoid that kind of pitfall.
Yeah, and I think that's why I started to explore a little bit more of the environmental justice literature, because there's been a lot of lessons on the distribution of funds, for example, by the World Bank, or of when you assume that the population is homogeneous and you don't consider all of the different perspectives, visions, cultures that are affected by how you're distributing the money, you can just perpetuate dynamics of imbalances in the communities. So yes, it's more like I'm taking those global lessons to understand what's happening here. Yeah. Yep.
In the context of small scale fisheries, how has law enforcement kind of been implemented to ensure sustainability? Is there any challenges or successes that have been seen?
Yeah, no, it's a huge challenge. I mean, but it is a huge challenge because it is used like as a double, it's useful to, in a way that has harmed and in a way that has helped, if I can say it that way. So for example, I would say that if you have enforcement with corruption and enforcement is only applied in a few and not in others, that's something that we've seen in the Upper Gulf of California. There's just like the thing becomes even harder to manage. So yeah, enforcement plays a huge role here, both for good and bad. Yep.
I think you said you were working with a local NGO. Do you think that strategies like this can be used to get help from larger NGO organizations, or
The
like last case study, you were working with a local NGO, right?
Yeah.
So do you think like communication strategies would be different if it was for larger?
Yeah, so this case study is like one of those things that when I talk to people about it, it's like, well, yeah, it sounds great, but who can send someone for 2 years to, and so the problem is that there's, I think, both processes are undervalued by a lot of the big, the main funding sources. So the NGO person told me, like, yeah, this was such a valuable experience, but I've never been able to replicate, like, we've never been able to do it again. Nobody wants to fund sending somebody for 2 years to a community to work. And so for large NGOs, it's really hard to justify to use the funds like that because it's not as valued. But I do think that there has to be sort of a change, hopefully there, in which we see more the value of creating these strong connections and creating these ways to really disrupt some of the power dynamics that are currently operating in those places. Yep.
Do you see a way for buyout programs to be improved as a tool for success in these fisheries? Like, is there a way to avoid these pitfalls that happen in that first case study?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think I would be interested in hearing what would be ways to to improve them. I mean, definitely one of the first ones for me would be to have a clear idea of who are the players, right? Which is what I was exposing here. But there might be many other things that need to be done to improve them, that I've probably been exploring in this stuff. Yeah. Yep.
Coming back to this, issue of compliance or enforcement, to what extent can these small communities actually police themselves through peer pressure and through a sort of a sense of community buy-in?
They are very involved in enforcement and surveillance, and they can't, for example, they have limitations. They can't obviously detain somebody. They need to call the authorities to, if anything is happening. But they had a recent event where a boat came in one of the refuge areas, and because, and this is a story that one of the persons I interviewed told me, and because they are now so close to Conapesca, literally the fisher just picked up the phone and said, there's someone in our area, and someone came immediately to take him out of there. So they are very involved, but they obviously are limited with what they can do. Also, these areas are not concessions, for those that are familiar, they're not churches. So they don't have an authority over over the whole polygon. They just have authority over these small refuges, but it's helping them maintain the attention of the authorities over the whole region. Yeah. Yes. I don't know if that answers the question. Yep.
Yeah, I'm wondering about, in the implementation of the two different strategies, just like the role of, like urgency, and like how that might have, like, I was thinking, compared to like living for 2 years versus the sort of crisis of extinction, and just what role that might have.
Yeah, and this was actually a conversation that came up earlier when we were talking to the students, and I think a lot of what has happened in the outlook of California is the result of that sense of urgency. I mean, I don't think that the authorities and the people that were working there were not aware of these power dynamics. I mean, these are people that have been working in this area for many years. But I think at that point, it was a sense of we need to act now. We cannot wait, and we can just hope that this works kind of situation. And the problem was that I don't think they were able to foresee how much of the negative consequences of that action, how negative the consequences of those actions were going to be. I think at that point it was this feeling of we need to take the risk. And a lot of the things that have happened in the upper Gulf of California, I think, have been related to that sense of these species is going extinct. We need to act now. We need to act now. And I understand that urgency, but at the same time, I think it has had very, very negative consequences for the local community. Yeah.
So if you think that the buyout program had been structured differently and had this mechanism to make sure the payments were then pushing out to the different people involved that might not be a permit holder, do you think the level of capital stuffing would have been the same?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't know. It could be that capital stopping would happen anyway. I think that the only one difference there would have been that probably not everybody would have just jumped into doing illegal, like other illegal activities. The problem is that now they didn't have a way to land anything legally. So even if you increase your effort, you need a permit to land it. And so I think more the consequence was in terms of how to increase the legality in the region. But I think I would have to think about capital stopping and how much that would change if the distribution would be different. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. Yeah.
So, I know you started by saying we shouldn't be comparing these, so, but I can't help myself.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about enabling, based on the two stories you told, I think it sounded like the more southern case study had a sort of more balanced notion of inclusion, whereas the upper case study you had your permit holders, and then you had a bunch of people who were fishing, but were essentially not officially sanctioned, right? So you're walking into a case where you have some environmental justice issues and access issues to begin with. And then I think the story I heard was that kind of undermined what they tried to do. And so is there a prescription there, or do you just use the environmental justice principles to realize that this is going to be a tough case?
No, so I want to first say that in both case studies, there were flower problems because in the second case study, as I mentioned, these communities were not even in the map. I mean, they didn't have permits. Conapesca did not know who they were. So if any decision was taken of management, fisheries management in that region, we would never consider them. Because there were no fishers in the eyes of the Mexican government. And those towns actually were not in the map because since the fishers did not have their permits, they did not land their fish in those towns. So those towns were not landing sites. So there was, I do see parallels in the two case studies in terms of the lack of capacity, the lack of identification of who was there and really what were the cultural values, what were the histories, what were the needs and economic needs. Yeah, I think there are parallels between those two case studies in that sense, and that's why I brought I've been bringing up this concept of environmental justice because for me was that's the literature that really reflects these problems. So I don't know that.
Yeah, so then follow up you're walking into a situation where there is environmental injustice, right? So it's not that you're causing it by implementing the policy that exists.
So it's weird because I'm using it in a different way because I'm using these principles to explain patterns that I'm observing, but it is not like the situation for what environmental justice have flown mostly, that is there was an action and there were some people affected and because of that. So it is a bit different for me in the way in which I'm implementing it here. But I asked my environmental justice scholar friends if that was okay. So the problem was that when I was looking at these dynamics, the literature I'm familiar with, which is governance literature and other scholarly bodies, did not give me the frameworks that I needed to look at this stuff. So that was why I yep.
You started out your talk by saying that different people have different perspectives on success.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that probably many of us took away a different lesson. And what I heard was basically your southern case study was largely from bottom up.
Yeah.
Whereas, the northern case study was really the government trying to solve a problem and you think that's in general, through small scale fisheries, that if you want to be successful, it's going to have to come from the community rather than being imposed either by a government or an NGO?
I think it depends on the challenge, but I do think that in general, the closer we can come to know what the needs and what the landscape is with this community, the closer we're going to get to successful results or results that represent better what they want to happen in their communities.
Last question.
Yeah.
I want you to talk a little bit more about shared data.
Yeah.
And what kind of data are now collectively held in the community.
Yeah, I think that's.
And then how does it matter?
Yeah, so I think that's the most valuable part of that exercise that has been done here, the whole process here. This was a site where there was, for which there was no information, no information. Like by the time the very bathymetric studies were done, the fishers were the ones that they like, oh yeah, that's like a big or whatever, like all the information came from the fishers. And so, I think through that process of them confirming and being part of the creation of information, holding the information, first, they were able to build trust on the process. So the type of data that they have access to now is very firsthand data on, they participate in the monitoring, diving monitoring processes, so they see, they are part of the ones counting everything. And the other one is they also participate in the fishing monitoring. So they have access, like firsthand access to both types of data. There's some data that the NGO has had to process and give them back. So there is a bridge there for example, calculations of biomass growth for different species and things like that. But all of the reports and everything are distributed throughout the communities. And I think that having that information created two things. The first one is that it allowed them to build trust on the process and what they were seeing and doing. And that's the information that they use to renew their sites. The sites are renewed by them. So they are the ones that solicit renewing their sites or growing them or taking them away. So they use that for that. And I think the other thing is that it really has given them power over those decisions, because right now, for example, if the NGO was like, oh no, you gotta keep that one, they can go and say like, no, that site is not working, it's not giving any results, and we're gonna take it away, which happened with I think 2 sites already. So it has given both trust and power. It's been a key part of the process.
All right, if you haven't had a chance to ask a question, you can ask outside at the refreshments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Most people go right to the end of that.
Oh, yeah, no, there's no way, I don't have that much to talk about.
No, that was.